pray tonight as we start that you would be among us, that you would be at work. As we look at the gospel or the book of Ruth, that we would see the gospel in it. I thank you for the worship that we just had, for what you have for us in your word. In your name, amen. Hey guys, how y'all doing? Oh man, that game was fun. Alright, so I'm excited and we got some places to go, so I'm going to clear off the stage a little bit so I can get going. Alright, first question, really important one. Who's seen the end game?
No.
Yeah. Who has seen the end game? Alright. You can pray for the rest of you guys. Alright, so something I heard somebody say recently, and I just really wanted to dial into, is we are in the book of Ruth. And tons of people, a weekend and a half ago, went to go see this movie. How much? I was like 2.6 billion, right? How many movies are in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Does somebody know? 22 movies. So we packed theaters, 22 movies to see what? 22 movies to see what? One story, right? And so as we sit down to study this book, do you know that, like, as great as Marvel is and Iron Man is and all those other things, that story, that longing for a great story narrative in our hearts, that's fiction, but this thing is real. And so this one that I hold in my hand is like 66 books written by 40 different authors, all breathed out by God, who created you and me and who's going to exist for eternity, and that really matters. And so as much as we cram-pack theaters to go see great stories and narratives, it comes from this. Because our longing for a story that matters finds truth in the Bible. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at Ruth, and it's connected, just like every Marvel movie is connected, it's connected to the larger narrative of God's Word. And so if you could stand with me for the reading of God's Word, let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to read Ruth chapter 1, starting at verse 22, so we can remember where we were at. And Patrick did an amazing job last week talking about redemption, talking about loss and loyalty. But we're going to start Ruth chapter 1, verse 22. It says, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech." Let's pray over God's Word real quick. Lord, I thank you for this story. I pray that we would learn from it as it tells us about you. It shows us your character, it shows us your heart, it shows us your love. And so I pray that we would see those tonight. This narrative is exciting and beautiful, and I pray that through my mouth people would hear it. They would hear your words. That I would be able to share, and that it would impact hearts, and that you would move among this place. In your name, amen. All right, y'all can be seated. Okay. All right, who loves a good, loves is a good word. So we're going to look at a love story. Who likes a love story, or who's a romantic in the room? Nobody's? All right. Well, you're all in for it, because this is a romance story. So raise your hand, people. All right. So what the background is, last week Patrick introduced it to us. Judges tells us this. Judges 21:25 tells us the historical setting of the book of Ruth. And what Judges 21:25 says, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And so that's the darkness of this moment in Israel's history. So God had delivered his people, and nobody was following him. And then we get into these 2 books. And we talked about Samuel. We get to Ruth and Samuel. And these 2 God-fearing men and one woman pursued God. And they modeled for us that they didn't do what was right in their own eyes. They did what was right in God's eyes. And so the first thing on there I want to talk about is, as we enter this narrative of redemption, which Patrick talked about last week, is that God is working a plan of redemption by His grace and for His glory among all the nations. And so whenever we look at a Bible book inside this whole collection, one book inside these 66, it's speaking into that narrative that God's doing a much bigger thing, a bigger story. And so His narrative of redemption is all over this. I put up there, this is a slightly edited line from one of the other passages that I love, but plan of redemption by His grace. We don't deserve it. For His glory. He wants to be seen. Glory, the best way to describe glory, in my opinion, is that He wants people to see Him. So His visible presence among us, but also that He's praiseworthy. So when we live for God, they see who God is, and they get a picture of who He is, but also how valuable He is. And so that's what He is working. But before we get into this narrative, we need to talk about 2 words. And so I put them up on the screen. We got redemption and character. Does someone know what redemption means? Do you all remember what Patrick told you guys last week? Come on, what does redemption mean? What is to redeem something? You guys know this. Come on. Betsy, you got it?
I mean, what do you like?
Do I need to change what I'm going to preach about?
Redeem. Here, I'll watch. Give this to me. I'm going to give you this.
Oh,
now
okay.
I'm redeeming this leg.
Oh, okay. So it's an exchange, right?
Such a bad trick.
So redemption, when we're talking about it in biblical terms, means to buy back or purchase, right? And so I brought this. This is a piece of my artwork.
Ah.
So yeah, see, look at that. So this is a piece of my artwork, and so I created this. And this illustration is nowhere near what it should be, but it gives you a picture of what it is. So I created this, and just like God created us, but not really, but go with the illustration for a second. So I created this, it belongs to me. But God put each one of us kind of with a will of our own. So we got to decide whether we were going to actually belong or stay in fellowship with God, or if we were going to go after things that weren't, that led us away from God, right? So Genesis 3 talks about that. So what happens is we left God, fellowship with Him, and we went somewhere else. So we went somewhere else.
Okay, no one asked you.
And now we're slaves to sin, right? That's what the Bible tells us, is that we pursued things that seemed right in our own eyes. We left God. And He was right, because He was God, to punish us for pursuing sin. Because it's against Him. Because we left Him, we denied His rules, and we went somewhere else. And so what God does is He has to punish that sin. Somebody has to pay for that sin. And so redemption, when we talk about it in a biblical sense, is the fact that someone had to pay for the sin that whatever I created or we created, or God created us, did. That He had to pay to bring us back into relationship with God. And so the Bible talks about that Jesus came and He redeemed us. And what that means is the penalty we deserved for running away from God, Jesus bore on the cross for you and for me. And so when we talk about redemption, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that God was right to punish us, but instead of punishing us, He sent His Son to die for us. And so then we can have a restored relationship with God. All right? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about redemption. Character, we're going to talk about something else. Because the characters in this story are going to model godly character. And so I put some definitions up on the screen because character needs to be defined. And character is a person's, character is the sum of his or her disposition, thoughts, and desires and actions. It is good to remember that character is gauged by general tendencies, not on the basis of a few isolated actions. So this is who we are as a person. It's not one action, but it's who we are as a person. And then Oswald Chambers said this. He said, the expression of Christian character is not good doing, but God-likeness. If If the Spirit of God has transformed you within, you will exhibit divine characteristics in your life. God's life in us expresses itself as God's life, not as human life trying to do godly things. And so what this is saying is if God is in us, we're going to start displaying His godliness through us. And what we're going to do tonight is I want to look at these two characters. We're going to look at Ruth and Boaz. And we're going to see how they modeled godly character. And we're going to think about the fact of, have I been redeemed? Do I actually belong to God? And then if I do belong to God, am I starting to show the world what He looks like? Because Ruth and Boaz both belong to the Lord first. And then they started modeling godly character that we can learn from them. So, let's hop into that. The first, God displays Himself and His plan through everyday men and women who honor God first. I put there at the top of your list. And then your first blank is we're going to look at Ruth. And Ruth displays God's character through humility and by doing the right thing. Ruth displays God's character through humility and by doing the right thing because it was the right thing and without a promise of a reward. This is something that I want you guys to see because as people who belong to God, we do something that's right because it's right, not because we get a reward. A lot of us have done things because we'll do it because we get a reward. And we see that Ruth models doing the right thing because it's the right thing. And so we just read that passage and it says, in Ruth chapter 2 verse 1, it says, now Naomi had a relative, a worthy man. And we got at verse 2, it says, and Ruth the Moabite said, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And so Ruth promised Naomi, the chapter before, if you guys heard it, that your God's going to be my God. I'm going to serve you, be with you, and I'm going to die next to you. And she's going to be a part of that. So she's being faithful. So she set out and she went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened. I love that word right there. She happened. This is God's moment in the story. She just happened. It didn't just happen. God was behind it. God knows what's going on in our lives. So she happened to come to a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. What I want you all to focus on is Ruth models being faithful. She said God's character through humility and doing what is right. She was faithful. She was out there doing the work. Principle that I want you guys to think about, godly women, godly men, do the work that's in front of you. Be faithful to what's in front of you. We know from the chapter before this that she was without a husband, and she could have done a lot of things, but she did the work that was right in front of her. And she's going to get complimented for that later. So Boaz shows up. Verse 6. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is this young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came. Then Boaz said to Ruth. So now we're going to look at Boaz. So Ruth is being faithful. And then your second says, Boaz displays God's character by protecting, providing, and praying for God's daughter. And I'll go through that again. Boaz displays God's character by protecting, providing, and praying for God's daughter. How does he do that? Verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field. He sees her faithfulness. He says, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. These are his servants, other servants who were there. This was customary in Jewish times, is that when they went out to harvest, the men would harvest, and the women would come behind and would help gather what was left behind. And so Ruth goes to this field. She's trying to be faithful to get some extra. And God provided so that widows and people who were in need could go and do that. They could get extra. And so Boaz sees that, and he says, glean in my field, like get from what I have. And actually, don't just go behind my servants, be with my servants. He's providing for her. Verse 9, it says, let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged you, the young men, not to touch you? He says, I'm going to protect you. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. 10. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? She's doing this with humility. You see, Ruth was from Moab, and she was not Jewish. And what that meant is that Moabites at this point in time actually at some points had ruled and battled against the Jewish people. And so she knew as someone who was there, she was a foreigner, she was an exile, she didn't belong. And so she was trying to be humble. And she's like, why have you taken favor for me? Why are you caring about me? And Boaz says something profound. He says in verse 11, but Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. She was known. Her reputation for being faithful was known. My question for you guys is, what are you known for? What are you guys known for outside of this building? Because here's Ruth's tag. She was known as being faithful, as being devoted, as pursuing the Lord. It's been fully told to me. And how you left your father and your mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. He blesses her. He says, I want to provide for you. I want to protect you while you're here reaping in my fields. And he says, I want the Lord to bless you because I've seen your faithfulness. So my challenge to you, godly ladies, desire more godliness and be faithful to what God has called you to do. Because that's what Ruth did here. Patrick went over last week that her husband died and she remained faithful. And here she is working and God is rewarding her. But she was doing what was right before the reward even came. And so I just say this, men and women, godly men and women, be faithful to what God's called you to, even when you don't see the reward right in front of you. But Boaz prays to bless her. So, 13. So we've seen the provision, the protection, the praying. So let's get into some of the fun part. Because all of it's great, but there's some cool stuff here that's going to go down. So don't lose what we're doing here. 13. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. And at the mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers and she ate until she was satisfied and she had some left over. And so this woman goes to a field and reaps, and it happens to be the field of one of the men that was able to help her situation. He cares for her, provides food. The passage goes on to say that she reaped behind them all day. She worked all day. And they actually gave her extra. And she came back home with about 30 pounds of wheat. Can you all carry 30 pounds? No. That was unheard of. There was more than enough for them to satisfy. Yeah, you got 30 pounds, right? Come on. All right. But she brings all that back. Verse 18, I want to pick this up because all of you, I'm sure all of you have these people in your lives. So Naomi desires for Ruth to be married and wants the best for her. And so she's like waiting. So let's see what happens when she gets back. So 18. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she said, I know something's going on here. Something's extra going on over here. Then she beat out what she had gleaned. And she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. There was more than enough. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? I hear this as that, rhetorical, like, where did this come from? Like, something's going on. And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and the man's name was with whom he had worked today was Boaz. And you see, he goes, The Lord's favor is upon us. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Tides have changed. The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides this, he said to me, you shall keep close to my young men until they have finished all my harvest. She goes, oh, this is someone who can rescue us. This is someone who can redeem our situation. And he has invited her to continue through the harvest. And so it's boiling and it's going. All right? So, verse 21, or 22. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. She says, this is going to keep you safe. This is going to keep you where God is blessing you, where he's been faithful, you've been invited into. God can provide for you right there. And he's already done it. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And so Ruth was faithful. So, to review what we just looked at, we looked at the fact that Ruth displayed God's character by being faithful to Naomi, even without the promise of a reward. She did what was right in front of her. And then we looked at Boaz, who obviously was pursuing the Lord, had a relationship with God. He sees this woman who was a foreigner, who would have been pushed aside, and he cares and protects her. And then he prays a blessing over her. And so I already told you as young ladies that you need to be faithful where God has called you, and young men. The second thing I would also say is, are the people around you, are you seeking to bless them? Do you pray for them? Do you care about them? Because when we model godly character, we're going to love and care for people similar to the way Boaz did. I'm not going to steal Daryl's thunder from next week, but Boaz comes from a line where his mom was also a foreigner among God's people. And she would have been probably treated differently because of her past and what she had done. And so Boaz grew up with a mom who was treated differently because who she was and was pushed away to the side. And so one day, he goes to the field and he sees another foreigner among God's people who loves the Lord, who's part of his family. And he says, I know her, and I know that she's faithful, and I'm going to bless her. And I pray that the Lord would bless her. And so I ask for you guys, are you praying for, protecting, and giving to those around you? Are you blessing the people you're around? When people see you coming, is it a blessing experience, or is it a avoiding experience? Because when we're modeling God's character, we're gonna actually try to bless people. So, all right. Last segment, the last note. It said, godly men and women, I put it this way, honor God. I put honor there. It's really just about, we put God first. We care most about what he says. And what's important is what he says. And others. Godly men and women honor God and others as they walk by faith. So don't lose what's going on here. What's happened is she's met this dude. You've all been in this situation, if you've ever been in a relationship, is you met someone, you thought you had a connection, and then it's been a while. And the bubbles didn't show up on the text message. Or the Snapchat thing didn't come through. Or you're wondering if the person deleted their Facebook. Okay? That's the moment you're at. That's the moment we're at this story right now. You're like, did this person ghost me? Does he care? Is he going to move? Is he going to do anything? And so Naomi, as the mother-in-law, tells Ruth, we got to do something about this. Okay? So so it's been a full harvest season. Did you notice that? The last verse says the harvest season ended. So she's worked, we had a great first day, and then the end of the harvest is you're not going to his field anymore, you're not seeing this dude anymore. Somebody's got to intervene. Somebody's got to move, okay? So then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Threshing floors were on top of hills, okay? So she's saying the work is done, and he's up there, and you're down here, and this isn't good. She says, so, wash yourself. She's like, make yourself look good. Wash yourself and anoint yourself, and parten your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. I'm just going to say it this way. Whatever dating relationship you're in, there is a right and a wrong way and a right and a wrong time to approach someone. And she's saying this way, you want to make yourself look presentable and go at the right time. But, moving forward, and she replied, all that you say, I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded. I'm not going to comment on all this. Aside from to say that it keeps moving. 7. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry. Yep. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And so this was something that was said, and I need to comment on it. Naomi tells Ruth, wait until Boaz is done threshing wheat. He's completed the task. And he's going to sleep on the threshing floor. All right? Hold up a second. You guys. He's going to sleep on the threshing floor because the point there was to sleep where the harvest was so that nobody stole it. And she's told, go and uncover his feet. And then when he wakes up, ask for him basically to propose marriage is what happens. And so it was a point of putting someone's cloak over someone. So this is Ruth proposing to Boaz is what it is. All right? So, what happens? Verse 9. Boaz is like my dad. If you want to wake my dad up, the fastest way to wake my dad up is to touch his feet. It's guaranteed up. All right? So Ruth comes in, uncovers his feet, which has just what that is, uncovered feet, because he had, blanket on. Yep. And at midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, who are you? And she answered, I'm Ruth, your servant. And he spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. She makes a claim. She's like, this is what's been told to me, is that you're a redeemer. Will you be the fulfillment of your prayer promise that you made earlier in this chapter, that God would provide someone to redeem and care for us? And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for all for you that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. So here's what Boaz says. Many scholars believe Boaz was probably a little bit older, or potentially much older than Ruth. And he says, you didn't go after a young man, or you didn't go after men like you could have. He says, no, you've stayed in the Lord's will. You've asked for what God wanted. And he says, I know who your character is. I know you're a worthy woman. Earlier in the book of Ruth, Boaz was referred to as a worthy man. So at this point, we have a worthy man and a worthy woman who are living for the Lord first. And then God brings them together. To finish up the story, it says, and now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, let it be. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. And so the end of the story is she lays down, and then he wakes her up in the morning, and he gives her double the portion of wheat that he gave her the first time. So she got like 30 pounds the first time, and he gives her about 60 the second, and sends her home and says, I will take care of this. Boaz was a man of his word. When we model godly character, we're going to be people of our word. We're actually going to live that out. When we make a promise, we're going to keep it. And so she goes home. And Naomi's wondering what happened. So let's finish in 16. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." So, we see in this story Ruth and Boaz, who model godly characteristics. If you didn't pick up on them, they're the words that are in your notes. Ruth was faithful. She was humble. Boaz protected. He prayed. He was generous. And then he was a man of his word. And so as we finish tonight, and as we think about this bigger theme of redemption, that Daryl gets to close this up next week. And we're going to talk about how God ends this story and how he makes it turn out for the good. I have to ask us, Boaz and Ruth both belong to God. Do you belong to God? Because in the story of redemption, we've all pursued sin. But the coolest thing about Jesus is that no story is beyond redeeming. No matter what you've been through, no matter what you've gone after, no matter how dirty or messy or whatever you feel like, God wants you to come home. He created you for a relationship with him, and the pathway to that relationship is Jesus. And he redeems us through his Son. The second thing is, if you already belong to God and you've been redeemed, the second question I want to ask, are you displaying his character? I put those sentences up at the beginning because it talks about that if we really allow God into our hearts, that's going to start bleeding out into our lives. So are we modeling that character? Have you been redeemed? Are you modeling godly character where God has placed you? Let's pray. Lord, there's a lot of text tonight. There's a lot of story. There's a lot of things going on. A lot of details. But Lord, you gave us this book of Ruth to talk about your heart for people. That these 2 godly, one a man and one a woman, pursued you. And so I pray that you would give us the ability to do the same. I pray tonight, Lord, that no one would leave without having a real relationship with you and knowing they've been redeemed. And then tonight, Lord, as we go through some of these characteristics, you need to form them in us. And so I pray that we would find one and say, Lord, I need more of that. I'm not following you in that. So tonight, Lord, I pray that you would be among us, that you would be in the discussions that are going to happen now. In your name, amen.